My son told me I was just another bill they couldn't pay. His voice cracked when he said it, but his eyes never met mine. Clara kicked my suitcase toward the door, like I was trash to be thrown out. I reached for my coffee cup. My hands were shaking too much. The cup fell, shattered across their clean kitchen tiles. Nobody moved to help me clean it up. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The door slammed behind me with a sound I'll never forget. David had stood there watching, saying nothing while his wife Clara crossed her arms and told me they couldn't carry me anymore. I had been living in their guest room since my heart surgery. 3 months of trying to stay invisible, folding their laundry, washing their dishes, moving like a ghost through their perfect house. I cooked dinner every Tuesday, cleaned bathrooms on Saturdays, watered Clara's plants without being asked. But Clara called me a burden anyway, and my son let her. The night before they threw me out, I had made David's favorite cookies. Chocolate chip. The same recipe I used when he was 8 years old. He didn't even thank me. Just left them on the counter to grow stale. I left with one duffel bag and an old umbrella. The rain soaked through my thin coat before I reached the street. My surgical scar ached under the wet fabric. The doctor had told me to avoid stress, to rest, to let my heart heal properly. Instead, I was homeless at 72. The bus stop bench was cold, metal that cut through my clothes and chilled my bones. I waited until midnight. No bus came. Cars passed with their headlights cutting through the rain. Families going somewhere warm, somewhere they belonged. I didn't belong anywhere, so I walked 6 blocks in the rain to the only place with lights on. A 24-hour diner with cracked vinyl seats and coffee that tasted like burnt hope. The floor was sticky under my wet shoes. The air smelled of grease and disinfectant, but it was dry. I sat in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a chipped white mug, pretending the warmth could reach the cold place in my chest. My reflection stared back from the dark window. An old woman with gray hair plastered to her skull, eyes red from crying. This was what my son had discarded. The waitress was young, maybe 20, tired eyes but gentle hands when she refilled my cup without asking. Her kindness felt foreign after months of being treated like furniture. I watched her serve other customers. A trucker eating pie, a couple arguing over their bill, late-night people with their own troubles. I wasn't special, just another lost soul seeking shelter from the storm. I wasn't a mother anymore. Not really. I wasn't even a patient recovering from surgery. I was something my own son had thrown away. The coffee grew cold. I ordered another cup, then another. The clock above the counter moved slowly. 2 a.m., 3 a.m., the longest hours of my life. I thought about David as a boy. How he used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. How I would hold him until he stopped shaking. Now he had thrown me into my own storm, and there was no one to hold me. Dawn came gray and unwelcome through the diner windows. I paid with crumpled bills from my purse and walked back into the morning. My legs felt heavy, each step an effort. The surgical fatigue the doctor warned me about. A motel on Route 9 had a weekly rate I could barely afford. The clerk was half asleep behind bulletproof glass. He took my cash without looking up. Room 237. Second floor. No elevator. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding from the effort, from the fear of what came next. The room smelled like cigarettes and bleach. The bedspread was orange with stains I didn't want to think about. Water marks on the ceiling. Carpet worn thin by desperate people. But it was mine. No one could kick me out of this ugly little space. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. This was my kingdom now. $40 a day for 4 walls and a door that locked. I unpacked my duffel bag on the thin mattress. Clothes I had worn for 40 years. Sweaters with pills. Slacks that had seen better decades. Medications in plastic bottles. Heart pills. Blood thinners. The pharmacy of an old woman trying to stay alive. A photograph of my husband from before the cancer took him. His smile still bright after all these years. Still believing in better tomorrows. And then I found something I had forgotten about. A metal tin wedged between my sweaters. My husband's tin. I hadn't opened it since the funeral 5 years ago. The lid was stuck. Rust around the edges. I pried it open with a butter knife from the motel's tiny kitchenette. Inside were receipts. Faded and folded. Old photographs of us when we were young. Bus tickets from trips we took when we had dreams instead of doctor bills. And one yellowed envelope addressed to me in his careful handwriting. Eleanor, only when you're alone. My fingers shook as I opened it. The paper was thin, fragile like everything else in my life had become. But the words were strong. He had bought property decades ago. Lakeside cabins under his cousin's name. He was afraid his modest salary wouldn't secure our future. So he had planned ahead. Quietly, without telling me. He wrote about summer evenings when he would drive out to check on the property. About his dreams of us retiring there together. About the fear that kept him quiet for so many years. If you ever need it, find Mr. Cho, attorney. He knows everything. I read the letter 3 times. Then 4. Then I pressed it against my chest and cried harder than I had. Since David closed that door. My husband had been gone for 5 years. But he was still taking care of me. Still loving me when my own son had stopped. I found Mr. Cho's number in the phone book. My hands were steady when I dialed. His voice was warm, patient. He remembered me, remembered my husband. He had been waiting for my call all these years. The cabins were real. 4 of them by a lake 2 hours north. The rental income was real. Steady money from summer families and weekend fishermen. The bank account that came with it made my knees weak. For months I had begged my son for shelter. For kindness. For the smallest space in his life. Now I held keys to my own doors. Mr. Cho handed me the brass key with a smile. The first genuine smile I had seen in months. He explained the business. The bookings. The maintenance account. The trust my husband had set up to keep it all legal. My husband, the bus driver, had been a secret businessman. Planning for the day when I might need to stand on my own. That night I slept better than I had since the surgery. The nightmares about being unwanted faded into something else. Plans. For the first time since David slammed that door. I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I was going to build. Mr. Cho had offered to drive me to the lake himself. But I needed to make this journey alone. He helped me arrange a rental car. A small sedan that smelled like air freshener in other people's lives. The drive took 2 hours through winding country roads. I had detailed directions written in Mr. Cho's careful handwriting. Turn left at the old grain elevator. Right at the red barn with the rusted roof. I drove slowly, taking in everything. Fields stretched on both sides. Corn stubble from last year's harvest. Farmhouses set back from the road with long driveways and barking dogs. This was a different world from David's suburban neighborhood. No manicured lawns. No homeowner associations. Just land and sky and the smell of earth through my open window. The lake appeared suddenly around a bend. Water so blue it hurt to look at. Pine trees crowding the shoreline like they were protecting something sacred. And there they were. 4 small cabins tucked among the trees. My cabins. I parked in the gravel driveway and sat for a moment. My heart was pounding, but not from exertion this time. From possibility. The first cabin had a green door and window boxes that needed replanting. Paint peeling from the shutters. A porch that sagged slightly on one corner. But it was beautiful in the way broken things can be beautiful. full of potential. I used the brass key Mr. Cho had given me. The lock turned with a satisfying click. The door opened to reveal hardwood floors scarred by decades of use. A stone fireplace with ashes still in the grate. Windows that looked out on the water through dust and spider webs. The air smelled like pine and old wood and something else. Something that might have been happiness once upon a time. I walked through each room slowly. Kitchen with vintage appliances that probably still worked. Bedroom with a quilt folded at the foot of the bed. Bathroom with a clawfoot tub and fixtures from the 1950s. Everything was old but solid. Built to last by people who understood permanence. In the bedroom closet I found a guest book. Families had signed it over the years. The Johnsons from Chicago. The Martinez family from Detroit. Children had drawn pictures of fish and trees and stick figure families having adventures. People had been happy here. Made memories here. Found peace here. I could do the same. The other 3 cabins were similar. Each with its own personality. One had built-in bookshelves and a reading nook by the window. Another had a screened porch perfect for morning coffee. The third had a workshop in the basement with tools still hanging on the wall. My husband had chosen well. He had found a place where families could escape their regular lives. Where children could catch fireflies and parents could remember what quiet sounded like. I spent the afternoon cleaning the cabin I had decided would be mine. Sweeping floors, washing windows, opening every door and window to let fresh air chase out the staleness. The work felt good, purposeful. My hands remembered how to scrub and polish and make things shine. As the sun began to set, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The lake was smooth as glass. A loon called from somewhere across the water. For the first time in months I felt something I had almost forgotten. Peace. My phone buzzed. A text from David. Mom, where are you? We need to talk. I read it twice then set the phone aside without answering. I wasn't ready to talk. I was barely ready to breathe on my own. The next morning I drove into town to meet with the local bank manager. A woman named Janet with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She knew about my husband's arrangement. Had been managing the rental accounts for years. The books were in good order. The cabins stayed booked from May through October. Winter was slower but ice fishermen still came. Hunters in the fall. There was money in the account. More than I had dared to hope. Janet explained the business side. How to handle bookings. When to charge cleaning fees. Which local contractors were reliable for repairs. She also told me about the community. The other cabin owners along the lake. The hardware store that delivered. The diner in town that served the best pie in 3 counties. I wasn't just inheriting property. I was inheriting a life. That afternoon I went back to the motel to pack my few belongings. The orange bedspread looked even uglier in daylight. The water stains on the ceiling seemed to be spreading. I left the key on the dresser and drove away without looking back. By evening I was settled in my own cabin. My own fireplace crackling with wood I had split myself. My own bed with clean sheets and a quilt that smelled like lavender. I made dinner in my own kitchen. Heated soup on my own stove. Ate at my own table while watching the sunset paint the lake gold. My phone buzzed again. David. Then Clara. Then David again. I turned the phone off. Outside my window the lake lapped gently against the shore. Night sounds began. Owls calling. The rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Wind in the pine trees. The sounds of a world that didn't judge. Didn't demand. Didn't throw old women out into the rain. I opened my husband's letter and read it again by lamplight. He had written about his hope that I would find peace here. That I would build something meaningful. That I would remember I was stronger than I knew. You are not a burden, Eleanor. You are a gift. And gifts should never be thrown away. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the mantel. Tomorrow I would start making this place mine. Really mine. But tonight I would just sit by the fire and listen to the lake whisper secrets only old women and lonely water know. I was 72 years old. Thrown away by my only child. Recovering from surgery that had nearly killed me. But I was not finished. Not even close. The first guests arrived on a Thursday morning in May. A family from Minneapolis with 2 young children and a golden retriever named Scout. They pulled up in a minivan packed to the roof with camping chairs and fishing poles. I watched from my kitchen window as they unloaded. The children ran straight to the lake. The dog barked at everything. The parents looked tired but hopeful. I had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment. 3 weeks of scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. Replacing burned-out light bulbs. Testing every faucet and door handle. 3 weeks of learning to be a businesswoman at 72. Janet from the bank had introduced me to the other cabin owners. Most were my age or older. Retirees who had turned lakefront property into modest income streams. They taught me the unwritten rules. Always have fresh coffee ready when guests arrive. Keep extra blankets in every closet. Never charge for ice. Be friendly but not intrusive. Be helpful but not hovering. Most importantly, they said, remember that people come here to escape. Don't bring them problems. Give them peace. I understood that better than most. The Minneapolis family stayed for a week. The children caught their first fish from our dock. The mother read 3 novels on the screened porch. The father learned to split firewood properly. When they left, the woman hugged me. She said they had never felt so rested. So connected as a family. That night I counted the week's earnings. More money than I had seen at one time since my husband died. But it wasn't about the money. Not entirely. It was about purpose. About being needed again. May turned to June. June to July. The cabins stayed full. Young couples on their honeymoons. Families with teenagers who complained about no cell service then forgot to check their phones. Older couples like my husband and I had once been. I learned each guest's story. The insurance adjuster from Detroit who came every summer to fish for walleye. The teacher from Chicago who brought her elderly father for quiet weekends. The widow from Milwaukee who booked the same cabin for 2 weeks every August. She had been coming for 15 years. Since her husband's funeral, we understood each other without words. I developed routines. Morning walks around the lake to check on things. Afternoon cleaning sessions between guest turnovers. Evening bookkeeping at my kitchen table. The work was hard. Harder than I expected at my age. Scrubbing toilets. Changing beds. Hauling garbage to the road. But my body remembered how to work. My hands remembered how to clean and fix and make things better. The surgical scar on my chest faded from angry red to pale white. My heart grew stronger with each passing day. David called every few days. I let the calls go to voicemail. He left careful messages, asking how I was, where I was, if I needed anything. I deleted them without listening to the end. Clara called once, left a message saying they were worried, that they wanted to work things out. I deleted that one immediately. In July, a water pipe burst in cabin 3. I woke at midnight to the sound of rushing water. By the time I got there, the bathroom was flooded. I called the emergency plumber Janet had recommended. He arrived at 2 a.m. with tools and patience. We worked together until dawn. Replacing pipes, mopping water, drying out everything that could be saved. The guests in cabin 3 were understanding. A retired couple from Iowa who had dealt with their own plumbing disasters. They helped carry water-damaged furniture outside. By noon the next day, everything was fixed. The carpet was drying. The bathroom was better than before. The couple from Iowa extended their stay an extra day. They said they had never seen a business owner work so hard to make things right. That evening I sat on my porch with a glass of wine. My back ached. My hands were raw from scrubbing. I smelled like bleach and pine cleaner. I had never felt more alive. August brought the usual crowd. The widow from Milwaukee in her regular cabin. Families making final summer memories before school started. And then, on a busy Saturday morning, David arrived. I was cleaning cabin 2 when I saw the familiar car in the driveway. The same sedan he had driven for 5 years. The one Clara had insisted they needed for her image. My hands stopped moving on the bathroom sink I was scrubbing. He stood by the car for a long moment, looking around at the cabins, the lake, the life I had built without him. Then he walked to the office, the small building where I handled check-ins and kept the business records. I watched through the cabin window as he read the sign. Pine Lake Cabins. Rates posted clearly. Rules about quiet hours and dock usage. He knocked on the office door. When no one answered, he walked toward my cabin. I could have hidden, pretended not to be there, let him wonder and worry like I had done for months. Instead, I walked outside, stood on my porch with the cleaning supplies still in my hands. We looked at each other across the space between my porch and his uncertainty. He was thinner than I remembered, gray showing at his temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked like a man who had lost something important. David told me he had hired a private investigator to find me. That Clara had left him 3 weeks ago. That he couldn't sleep or eat or think about anything except how wrong he had been. He said he was sorry. Over and over. Like the word could undo the sound of that door slamming. I listened without speaking, my hands steady on the bottle of glass cleaner I was holding. When he finished talking, I told him I had work to do. Guests were checking out, new ones arriving in the afternoon. He asked if he could stay, help with whatever needed doing, make up for lost time. I looked at my son. This man who had thrown me away when I needed him most. Who had let his wife call me a burden. Who had watched me pack my life into a duffel bag. I told him he could book cabin 4 if he wanted to stay. Same rates as everyone else. No special treatment. He nodded quickly, said he would pay whatever I asked. I handed him the registration form and the key. Told him checkout was at 11 a.m. sharp. That evening I saw him sitting on the dock, staring out at the water like it might hold answers to questions he was afraid to ask. I made dinner for 1 and ate alone, like I had been doing for months. But something was different now. Something had shifted in the space between my anger and his apology. I wasn't ready to forgive. Forgiveness would take time, maybe years, but I was ready to let him try to earn it. The lake was dark by the time I finished the dishes. David was still on the dock, a small figure against the vast water and sky. I turned off my lights and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new guests, new problems to solve, new chances to prove that I was anything but a burden. I was Eleanor, 72 years old, business owner, survivor, and I was just getting started. David stayed for 3 days. He followed the rules, checked out at 11 a.m. sharp, paid his bill without complaint, treated me like any other guest who happened to own the place. But I watched him from my kitchen window. He swept the dock without being asked, fixed a loose board on the steps to cabin 2, helped an elderly man from Wisconsin carry his fishing gear down to the water. He worked quietly, carefully, like someone trying to prove something to himself as much as to me. On the second evening I found him painting the fence around cabin 3. The white paint was chipped and weathered. It had been on my list of repairs for weeks. He had driven to town for the paint, bought brushes, started the job before I even knew about it. I stood watching him work in the fading light. His shirt was stained with paint. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He painted like his father used to. Steady strokes. Attention to detail. Taking pride in work most people would rush through. I remembered teaching him to paint when he was 12. The garage door of our old house. How he had wanted to do it perfectly even though no one would notice if he missed a spot. When had he stopped caring about doing things right? When had he learned to throw people away? I turned and went inside without saying anything. Made dinner for one like always. But I left the porch light on so he could finish the fence properly. The next morning I found a note slipped under my door. Mom, thank you for letting me stay. I know I don't deserve your kindness. The fence is finished and I cleaned the brushes. I hope it helps. I'll call before coming back. I love you, David. I read it twice then put it in my husband's tin with his letter. Some words need time to settle before you know what they mean. Labor Day weekend brought the summer's last rush. Every cabin full. Families squeezing out the final drops of vacation time. The Hendersons from Ohio, back for their 5th year in a row. Their teenage daughter had learned to water ski on our lake. Their son had caught his first base from our dock. The new couple from Tennessee. Honeymooners who spent most of their time on the screened porch reading to each other. The widow from Milwaukee in her usual cabin. She brought me tomatoes from her garden. We sat on my porch drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. She told me her husband had proposed to her on this lake 43 years ago. They had honeymooned in cabin 1. Celebrated anniversaries here. Scattered his ashes from the end of the dock. She said coming back each year was like keeping him alive. Like the memories lived in the water and the trees and the sound of loons calling at dawn. I understood. My husband had never seen this place alive. But his presence was everywhere. In the decisions he had made. The future he had secured. The love that still surrounded me even after he was gone. After the guests left on Monday, I walked the property alone. Checking for damage. Making notes about winter repairs. The cabins looked tired after a busy summer. Paint touched by weather. Dock boards worn smooth by bare feet. Gardens that needed weeding. But they had served their purpose. Given families what they came for. Peace. Connection. Time outside the rush of regular life. I had served my purpose too. September brought quieter days. Weekenders looking for fall colors. Hunters scouting for November. A few hardy souls who preferred the lake without crowds. I used the slower pace to plan winter projects. New curtains for cabin 4. A better heating system for cabin 2. A complete renovation of the bathrooms in cabin 1. David called every Sunday. We talked about weather, the business, safe topics that didn't require forgiveness or trust. He asked if he could visit again in October. I told him the same rules applied. Pay in advance. No special treatment. He came for a long weekend. Brought tools and work clothes. Spent 3 days winterizing the docks and cleaning gutters. We worked side by side without talking much. Our hands remembering how to work together even if our hearts were still learning. On his last evening we sat on the porch after dinner. The air was cold enough to see our breath. Stars bright in the clear sky. He told me about the divorce. How Clara had blamed him for everything. The lost income from his job. The stress of supporting me. The embarrassment of having family problems. She had found someone else, he said. A man with money and no complications. No elderly mother to worry about. He admitted he had been relieved when she left. That he had felt trapped in his marriage for years. Using me as an excuse to avoid facing his own unhappiness. He said throwing me out hadn't made his life easier. It had shown him what kind of man he had become. And he didn't like what he saw. I listened without commenting. Some confessions don't need responses. They need witness. Before he left the next morning, he asked if I needed anything for winter. Money for repairs. Help with heavy work. I told him I was managing fine on my own. He nodded like he expected that answer. Like he was learning to live with the consequences of his choices. After he drove away, I found another note. This one was longer. He wrote about being proud of what I had built. How the guests talked about me with respect and affection. How I had turned tragedy into triumph. He wrote about being ashamed of himself. For listening to Clara. For choosing the easy path instead of the right one. For forgetting that I had sacrificed everything for him when he was young. He promised to keep trying to earn back what he had thrown away. Even if it took years. Even if I never fully forgave him. The note ended simply. I'm sorry, Mom. I love you. This time I didn't put the note away. I left it on my kitchen table. Read it with my morning coffee. Let the words sink in slowly. October turned the maples red and gold. November brought the hunters and the first hard frost. I closed the cabins for winter except for cabin 4. A few hardy souls still came for ice fishing and snowmobile weekends. The quiet months gave me time to think. About forgiveness. About second chances. About the difference between earning something and deserving it. David had started earning, but there was still a long way to go. I spent winter evenings by my fireplace reading books I had never had time for. Planning improvements for next season. Writing letters to regular guests who had become friends. And sometimes I took out my husband's letter. Read his words about strength I didn't know I had. He had been right about so many things. About this place. About my ability to survive. About love being stronger than abandonment. But he had been wrong about one thing. I wasn't just strong. I was invincible. Spring would come. David would continue trying to earn his way back into my life. And I would decide, day by day, whether his efforts were enough. The power was mine now. The choice was mine. After 72 years of being shaped by other people's decisions, I was finally in charge of my own story. And I was writing it exactly the way I wanted it to end. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. David's voice was different, strained, like he was holding something heavy he couldn't put down. He told me Clara was in the hospital. Complications from what was supposed to be routine surgery. Her new boyfriend had disappeared when the bills started coming. She had given David's name as her emergency contact. Old habit, he said. From when they were married. The doctors needed decisions made. About treatment. About payment. About what to do if things got worse. He asked if I thought he should help her. I listened to the silence on the other end of the line. The weight of his question settling between us like snow. This was the test neither of us had expected. The woman who called me a burden. Who convinced my son to throw me away. Who treated me like furniture in my own family. Now she needed help from the very people she had discarded. I told David the choice was his to make. That I couldn't tell him what to do with his conscience. But I also told him something else. Something that surprised us both. I said if he decided to help Clara, I would help him. Not for her sake. For his. Because helping someone who hurt you is different than helping someone who hurt your child. And despite everything, David was still my child. He drove down from the city that weekend. We sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and talking about impossible choices. He looked older than his 45 years. Gray threading through his dark hair. Lines carved deep around his eyes. He told me he didn't love Clara anymore. Hadn't loved her for years. But he couldn't watch anyone die alone and afraid. Even someone who had destroyed his family. I understood that kind of burden. The weight of being decent when decency wasn't deserved. We drove to the hospital together. My first time back in the city since that night I waited at the bus stop in the rain. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. Fluorescent lights that made everyone look half dead. Waiting rooms full of people holding onto hope with white knuckles. Clara was in room 314, hooked to machines that beeped and hummed. Her face pale against the white pillows. Hair unwashed. The glamour she had always worn like armor stripped away by illness. She looked up when we walked in. Her eyes found mine first. I saw recognition there, and something else, something that might have been shame. She tried to speak, but the breathing tube made it impossible. Her eyes filled with tears that ran down her cheeks onto the hospital gown. David took her hand, told her she was going to be okay, that he would handle everything. I stood by the window looking out at the parking lot. Cars coming and going. People living their regular lives while we dealt with this moment that felt like the end of something. Clara squeezed David's hand, looked at me again with those desperate eyes. I walked to the bed, looked down at this woman who had made my life hell. She was somebody's daughter once. Somebody's little girl who got scared and made bad choices and hurt people she should have protected. Just like all of us. I told her she didn't need to worry about anything. That David and I would make sure she was taken care of. More tears. This time they looked like relief. The next 3 weeks blurred together. Hospital visits, insurance forms, difficult conversations with doctors about treatment options. David handled most of it, but I was there when he needed support. When the decisions got too heavy for one person to carry. We took turns sitting with Clara when she was conscious, bringing her ice chips when her throat was dry, reading to her when she couldn't sleep. She couldn't talk much with the tubes and medications, but she listened, and sometimes she would squeeze our hands to say thank you. Slowly, impossibly, she began to recover. The machines came off one by one. The color returned to her cheeks. She sat up in bed and asked for real food instead of IV nutrition. When she could finally speak, the first thing she said to me was sorry. Not the elaborate apology I might have expected. Not explanations or excuses. Just sorry. Small and quiet and real. I told her we all do things we regret. The important thing was learning to do better. She nodded like she understood. Like she was ready to try. Clara went to a rehabilitation center for 2 more weeks. David visited every day. I went twice a week, bringing books and magazines. We didn't become friends. We would never be friends. But we found a way to be civil. To treat each other like human beings instead of enemies. When she was finally released, she had nowhere to go. Her boyfriend had cleaned out their apartment and disappeared. Her family lived across the country and hadn't spoken to her in years. David offered to let her stay in his spare room while she recovered. Just until she could get back on her feet. I didn't try to talk him out of it. It was his choice to make. But I did tell him he was welcome at the lake anytime he needed space. That helping Clara was noble, but he didn't have to sacrifice himself to do it. He thanked me. Said he was learning the difference between being kind and being a doormat. Spring came early that year. Ice melted off the lake in February. Crocuses pushed through the snow around my cabin. I started preparing for another season. Cleaning, painting, planning improvements based on last year's guest comments. The Hendersons from Ohio booked their usual week in July. The widow from Milwaukee reserved her August stay. New guests found us through word of mouth and online reviews. Business was good, better than good, but more importantly, I was good. Strong, confident in ways I had never been before. David called one evening in April. He sounded lighter than he had in months. He told me Clara was doing well, that she had found a job and an apartment. That she was going to counseling to work on the anger that had poisoned her relationships. She had asked him to thank me again. For helping when she didn't deserve it. He said he was proud of me. For showing him what forgiveness looked like in action. Not forgetting what happened. Not pretending it didn't matter, but choosing to help anyway because that's what decent people do. After we hung up, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the lake gold and pink. 2 years ago I had been thrown away like garbage, discarded by my own son, left to sleep in a motel that smelled like other people's desperation. Tonight I owned 4 cabins and a thriving business. I had a bank account that let me sleep peacefully. I had guests who looked forward to seeing me every year. Most importantly, I had a son who was learning to be the man I had raised him to be. And I had learned something about myself that I never expected. Strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting up every time you do. Grace isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing kindness when anger would be easier. And forgiveness isn't about forgetting. The loons called across the water as darkness settled over the lake. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new guests, new chances to prove that throwing me away had been the biggest mistake my son ever made. Not because I was vindictive, but because I was valuable. And finally, after 72 years, I knew it. The letter arrived in May with the spring bookings. Cream-colored envelope, expensive paper, my name written in careful script I didn't recognize. Inside was an invitation to David's wedding. Not to Clara, to someone named Sarah, a teacher he had met at the library where he spent his evenings now that he lived alone again. The wedding would be small, the letter said. Just family and close friends. At a park pavilion by a different lake an hour north of the city. David had written a note at the bottom. I would be honored if you would come, Mom. Sarah wants to meet you. She's heard so many stories about your strength and grace. I set the invitation on my kitchen table and stared at it over my morning coffee. A wedding invitation. The first one my son had sent me in 20 years. The last wedding I attended was his first one. To Clara. In an expensive hotel ballroom with flowers that cost more than most people made in a month. I had worn my best dress and smiled for pictures and pretended to be happy while Clara's friends whispered about the groom's shabby family. Now David was marrying someone who wanted to hear stories about me. Someone who saw strength where Clara had seen only burden. I called the number at the bottom of the invitation. David answered on the second ring. His voice was light, happier than I had heard it in years. He told me about Sarah, how they met when he was researching local history for a project. How she made him laugh. How she brought him books about lake management and cabin maintenance. She knows about everything, he said. What I did to you. How badly I failed as a son. She says she can't wait to meet the woman who raised someone capable of learning from his mistakes. I told him I would think about coming. That I needed to check my booking calendar. The truth was I needed time to decide if I was ready for this step. If I trusted David enough to witness him make promises again. If I was ready to be someone's mother-in-law after being thrown away like trash. The busy season started in earnest in June. Every cabin booked solid through August. Families from all over the Midwest discovering our little corner of peace. I hired help for the first time. A local teenager named Emma who cleaned cabins and helped with check-ins. A handyman named Pete who handled repairs I couldn't manage alone. The business was growing, thriving. Word of mouth brought new guests every week. The online reviews glowed with praise for the clean cabins and peaceful setting and the kind woman who ran the place. The kind woman who ran the place. That's how they saw me now. Not as someone's burden. Not as a patient or a problem. As a businesswoman who had built something worthwhile from nothing but determination and an old husband's dream. In July I hired a photographer to take pictures of the property for a new brochure. Professional shots of the cabins at sunrise. Families fishing from the dock. The view across the lake at sunset. When the photos came back I barely recognized the place. It looked like a resort. Like somewhere people would plan vacations around. Like somewhere people would choose to spend their most precious commodity, time. The photographer had caught me in several shots without me knowing. Refilling the coffee pot in the office. Helping a child bait a fishing hook. Laughing with the widow from Milwaukee on my porch. In every picture I looked confident. Content. Like someone who belonged exactly where she was. Like someone who had never been thrown away by anyone. David visited twice that summer. Both times he brought Sarah. A quiet woman with kind eyes and calloused hands from her own garden. She helped with whatever needed doing. Swept porches. Weeded flower beds. Listened to guest stories about the fish that got away. She asked me about my husband. About how I learned to run a business. About the hardest parts of starting over so late in life. Her questions weren't intrusive. They were interested, like she genuinely wanted to understand the woman who had shaped the man she loved. On their second visit, she brought me a jar of her homemade strawberry jam. The label was handwritten in the same careful script as the wedding invitation. For Eleanor, who shows us all what strength looks like. With love, Sarah. I opened the jar that evening after they left. Spread the jam on fresh bread from the bakery in town. Sat on my porch watching the fireflies dance over the water. The jam was perfect. Sweet but not cloying. Made by hands that knew how to take simple ingredients and turn them into something special. Like what I had done with this place. With my life. Like what David was trying to do with his second chance. In August, the widow from Milwaukee brought her grandson for the first time. A boy of 8 who had lost his father the year before. She told me they were teaching each other how to grieve. How to keep loving someone who was gone. How to find joy again without feeling guilty about it. We sat on the dock one evening while the boy caught his first fish. She told me about the anniversary coming up. 25 years since her husband died. She had been angry for so long, she said. At him for leaving. At herself for surviving. At the world for continuing without him. But this place had taught her something. That love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. Becomes memory. Becomes story. Becomes the foundation for whatever comes next. I thought about my own husband. How his love had built the foundation I was standing on. How his planning had given me the tools to rebuild my life. How being thrown away had led me to the exact place I was meant to be. September brought the wedding invitation again. I had moved it from the kitchen table to the mantel. Then to my bedside table. Then back to the kitchen. A constant reminder of the choice I needed to make. David called the week before the ceremony. Asked if I had decided. I told him yes. I would come. But I had conditions. I would drive myself. Stay in my own hotel room. Leave whenever I felt ready. I would not pretend that everything was forgotten. That the last 3 years hadn't happened. But I would witness his promises to Sarah. Because she deserved a mother-in-law who showed up. Even if that relationship was still being built one conversation at a time. He thanked me with tears in his voice. Said it meant everything to both of them. The wedding was exactly what the invitation promised. Small. Simple. Focused on the promises rather than the performance. Sarah wore her grandmother's dress. David wore the same suit he had worn to his father's funeral. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. But the promises they made sounded like they meant them. Like they had learned the difference between words and commitment. When the minister pronounced them married, David kissed his bride, then walked to where I sat in the front row. He hugged me carefully. Like he was still learning if such gestures were welcome. He whispered thank you in my ear. For coming. For giving him another chance. For showing him what grace looked like. I hugged him back. My son. This man who had thrown me away then spent 3 years earning his way back into my life. The reception was held at the same pavilion. barbecue and potato salad and a cake Sarah had made herself. Dancing to music from a borrowed speaker. I stayed for 2 hours. Long enough to eat cake and dance one song with David. Long enough to welcome Sarah to what was left of our family. Long enough to see that David was finally happy. Really happy. For the first time since he was a boy. As I drove home that evening, I thought about circles. How they end where they begin, but the journey changes everything. 3 years ago David had slammed a door on me. Tonight he had danced with me at his wedding. 3 years ago I was homeless and heartbroken. Tonight I was driving to my own successful business and the peaceful life I had built with my own hands. The circle was complete, but I was not the same woman who had started the journey. I was stronger, wiser, more certain of my worth. I was Eleanor, 75 years old, mother, businesswoman, survivor, and I was finally, completely, home. Winter came early that year. Snow by Halloween, ice on the lake before Thanksgiving. But the cold didn't bother me like it used to. The fireplace kept my cabin warm. The business account kept my worries small. I spent the quiet months planning, reading, writing letters to regular guests who had become friends over the years. And thinking about the future. Not just mine, but the future of this place my husband had left me. This sanctuary he had built with bus driver wages and patient dreams. On New Year's Day, David and Sarah visited. They brought champagne and homemade bread and news that made my heart skip. Sarah was pregnant, 3 months along, due in summer. I was going to be a grandmother. I set down my coffee cup carefully. My hands were shaking, not from age but from joy I wasn't sure how to hold. David looked nervous, like he was afraid I might say something about his past failures. About how he had thrown away one family and now wanted to build another. Instead I hugged them both. Told them I was happy. That evening we sat by the fire talking about names. About nurseries. About the kind of grandparent I hoped to be. Sarah asked if I would teach the baby about the lake. About the business. About the great-grandfather they would never meet but whose love had built the foundation they would grow up on. I told her nothing would make me prouder. Spring brought the usual preparations. But this year felt different. Charged with possibility. With the promise of new life joining our small, hard-won family. I hired more help. Expanded the business. Added a 5th cabin using profits from the previous season. The new cabin was different from the others. Bigger, with a crib in the bedroom and a rocking chair by the window. A place where young parents could vacation without leaving their peace of mind behind. I named it the Sarah Cabin, after the woman who had brought my son back to himself. The grand opening was in June. Sarah was 6 months pregnant now, moving carefully but glowing with health. She cut the ribbon while David held her steady. The local newspaper covered the story. Grandmother-to-be expands family business to welcome new generation. The photographer caught me holding Sarah's hand as we watched David hang the cabin sign. In the picture we looked like what we were becoming. Family. Real family. Built on forgiveness and time and the stubborn refusal to let past mistakes define future possibilities. July brought the heat, and the busiest season one had ever seen. Every cabin booked, waiting lists for cancellations, guests returning year after year like homing birds. The Hendersons from Ohio brought their daughter's new baby. The widow from Milwaukee brought her grandson, now 12 and taller than his grandfather had been. New families discovered us through word of mouth and online reviews that read like love letters to a simpler time. Emma, my teenage helper, was now 22 and studying hospitality management. She talked about taking over the business someday. About keeping the family feeling while adding modern conveniences. I liked the idea of this place outlasting me. Of continuing to give families what they came for long after I was gone. In August, Sarah went into labor 3 weeks early. David called at midnight, voice tight with worry. The baby was coming fast. Sarah wanted me at the hospital. I drove through darkness to the same hospital where Clara had nearly died. But this time I was racing toward life instead of away from death. Baby Grace was born at sunrise. 5 pounds, 7 ounces of perfect possibility. Dark hair like her father's. Steady gaze like her mother's. When the nurse placed her in my arms, I understood something new about love. It multiplies instead of divides. Expands instead of depletes. Creates instead of consumes. This tiny person would never know about the door that slammed 3 years ago. About the nights I spent in a motel that smelled like desperation. She would only know about Saturday mornings at the lake. About a grandmother who taught her to fish and to paint fences and to believe that love is stronger than disappointment. I held her while Sarah slept. Whispered stories about the great-grandfather who had loved her before she existed. About the lake that would always be her second home. David sat beside me, tears on his cheeks. He told me he had been afraid. That he didn't know how to be a father. That he was terrified of making the same mistakes. I told him fear was good. It meant he cared enough to get it right. And I reminded him that he wasn't alone anymore. That Grace would grow up surrounded by people who had learned the hard way what family really meant. September was quieter. The summer crowds gone. The lake peaceful under autumn skies. I spent my days preparing the cabins for winter. But I also spent time holding my granddaughter. Teaching Sarah about the business. Showing David how to balance books and handle difficult guests. They talked about moving closer to the lake. About David taking over more of the day-to-day operations. About Sarah teaching children in the local school district. About Grace growing up where her great-grandfather's love had built something lasting. I liked their plans, but I also told them to take their time. To make decisions based on what they wanted, not what they thought I needed. I had learned to stand alone. I could keep standing as long as necessary. But I no longer had to. October brought the maple leaves turning red and gold. November brought the first hard frost. And December brought a letter that made me sit down hard in my kitchen chair. The state wanted to buy the lake. Turn it into a public recreation area. They were offering serious money. Life-changing money. Money that could set up trust funds for Grace's education. Money that could ensure David and Sarah never worried about their future. Money that would also mean bulldozers where pine trees grew. Parking lots where families had made memories. Crowds where there had been peace. I set the letter aside and walked to the lake. The water was gray under winter clouds. Ice forming along the edges like nature's own fence. This place had saved my life. Given me purpose when I had been discarded. Taught me that I was valuable when everyone else had forgotten. Now I had to decide if saving someone else's life was worth more than preserving the peace. I thought about my husband. About the bus driver who had scraped together enough money to buy this sanctuary. About his dreams of us growing old here together. I thought about the widow from Milwaukee. About the families who returned every year like pilgrims seeking grace. I thought about Grace. About whether she would grow up with bulldozers or base. With parking meters or pine trees. With crowds or the kind of quiet that lets children hear their own hearts beating. The decision wasn't really mine to make. It belonged to all of us. To everyone who had ever found healing in this place. But the power to make it was mine. The responsibility was mine. The gift my husband had given me wasn't just property. It was choice. The ability to shape the future instead of just endure it. I walked back to the cabin as snow began to fall. Large, soft flakes that caught the light from my windows. Inside, the fire was still burning. Coffee was still warm in the pot. The letter from the state was still waiting for an answer. But I already knew what that answer would be. Some things are worth more than money. Some places are worth more than profit. Some legacies are worth more than the paper they're written on. I was 75 years old. I had been thrown away and fought my way back. I had built something lasting from nothing but determination and an old man's dreams. Now I was going to make sure it lasted for Grace. For her children. For families not yet born who would need what this place offered. Peace. Healing. The radical idea that some corners of the world are still more valuable than the money they might bring. I picked up my pen and began to write my answer. No, thank you. This lake is not for sale. And it never would be. 5 years later, I was rocking Grace on the porch when she spoke her first full sentence. Grandma Eleanor's house by the water. Not just Grandma. Not just the lake house. But my full name attached to this place she had never known existed without me. She was 3 years old. Dark curls escaping from her ponytail. Paint on her fingers from the fence we had been touching up together. David and Sarah had moved to town the year before. Close enough to help with the business. Far enough away to have their own life. Grace spent every weekend with me. Learning to bait hooks. Collecting smooth stones from the shore. Helping me fold towels and make beds. She called it playing work. The serious business of keeping the cabins ready for the families who came seeking what we offered. Peace. Connection. Time outside the noise of regular life. The business had grown beyond anything I had imagined. All 5 cabins booked solid from April through October. A waiting list that stretched 2 years ahead. But I had kept the heart of it small. Personal. A place where children could catch fireflies and parents could remember how to breathe. Emma now managed the day-to-day operations. A college graduate with fresh ideas and respect for old values. She had suggested we expand. Add more cabins. Build a conference center. Turn the place into something bigger. I told her bigger wasn't always better. That some things were perfect at exactly the size they were meant to be. Like families. Like trust. Like the space between heartbreak and healing. That afternoon I walked Grace down to the dock. We sat with our feet dangling in the water while she told me about her day. She had helped her daddy fix a squeaky door. Helped her mommy plant flowers. Helped me count clean towels. Everything in her world was helping. Belonging. Being needed instead of being in the way. I thought about myself at 3 years old. Already learning that children should be quiet. That their needs came second. That love was something earned through good behavior. Grace was learning different lessons. That her voice mattered. That her help was valuable. That love was as certain as sunrise. As we sat there, I saw David walking down from the house. Moving slower than he used to. Gray threading through his hair. The weight of responsibility softening his shoulders. He was 48 now. A good husband. A devoted father. A son who had learned the difference between deserving forgiveness and earning it. He still sent me flowers every year on the anniversary of the night he threw me out. Not because I asked him to. Because he needed to remember. Some wounds heal better when they're marked instead of forgotten. He joined us on the dock. Grace climbed into his lap and told him about the fish we had seen. The birds we had counted. The way the water sparkled like diamonds. As the sun began to set, Sarah appeared with a picnic basket. We ate sandwiches and watched the lake turn gold in the fading light. Grace fell asleep against my shoulder as the stars appeared. David carried her up to the house while Sarah and I cleaned up the picnic. She thanked me for another perfect day. For giving Grace memories that would last a lifetime. I told her Grace was giving me something too. The chance to be the grandmother I had never expected to become. After they left, I sat alone on the dock. The water lapped gently against the pilings. Night sounds began their familiar chorus. I thought about time. How it moves in circles instead of lines. How we end up back where we started, but everything has changed. 5 years ago I had been a woman thrown away by her own son. Tonight I was the center of a family that chose to revolve around love instead of convenience. 5 years ago I had slept in a motel room that smelled like other people's desperation. Tonight I would sleep in my own bed in a house that smelled like pine and coffee and home. 5 years ago I had been a burden. Tonight I was a blessing. The transformation hadn't been sudden. It had come in small moments. Daily choices. The decision to help instead of hurt. To build instead of tear down. To forgive instead of forget. But mostly it had come from understanding something simple that had taken me 70 years to learn. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. I stood up from the dock and walked back to my cabin. The lights were warm in the windows. The fireplace was ready to light. Coffee was set up for morning. Tomorrow would bring new guests. New stories. New chances to offer what people came here seeking. But tonight was for reflection. For gratitude. For the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt from nothing but determination and an old man's dreams. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the drawer where I kept important papers. The deed to the property. Insurance policies. Business records. And at the bottom, the 2 letters that had changed everything. My husband's note about the property. David's first apology. I had saved them both. Not because I needed to remember the pain. But because I needed to remember the hope. Hope that love could survive betrayal. That families could heal from deep wounds. That second chances were real if you were willing to do the work. Now I took out a fresh sheet of paper. My own handwriting was shakier than it used to be. But my thoughts were clearer than they had ever been. I began to write. To Grace, when you're old enough to understand. Your great-grandfather bought this lake because he believed in tomorrow. Your father threw me away because he forgot about yesterday. You exist because we all learned to live in today. This place will be yours someday. Not because you're entitled to it. Because you understand what it means. It means that some things are worth more than money. That some people are worth more than the trouble they cause. That some wounds can heal if you give them enough time and love. It means that being thrown away doesn't make you garbage. It makes you someone who knows the value of being chosen. Your daddy made a terrible mistake when he was younger. But he spent years earning his way back to grace. That's the most important thing I can teach you about forgiveness. It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing what happens next. When you're ready, this lake will teach you what it taught me. That you are stronger than you know. That love multiplies instead of divides. That home isn't a place you're born to but a place you choose to build. And that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in soil that was once broken. I signed the letter and sealed it in an envelope. Wrote Grace's name on the front. Put it in the drawer with the other letters that had shaped our family's story. Someday she would need to know that her grandmother had been thrown away and found her way back home. That her father had made mistakes and learned to make amends. That their family was built on foundation stones of forgiveness and second chances and love that refused to quit. But tonight she was 3 years old. Safe in her parents' house. Dreaming of fish and fireflies and the grandmother who would always have time for one more story. Tonight that was enough. I turned off the lights and went to bed. Outside my window the lake whispered secrets to the shore. The same secrets it had been telling for years. That some things last. That some love endures. That some people, no matter how badly they're treated, never stop being worth the fight. I was 78 years old. Grandmother. Business owner. Keeper of family stories. And I was exactly where I belonged. At the lake my husband had dreamed of. In the life I had rebuilt with my own hands. Surrounded by the family that had learned to choose love over convenience. Tomorrow Grace would wake up wanting to help with something. David would call to check on business. Sarah would stop by with fresh bread. Emma would handle the guests. The lake would sparkle in morning light. Families would make memories that would outlast us all. The circle would continue. The story would grow. The love would multiply. And I would be here to witness it all. No longer the woman who was thrown away, but the woman who built something beautiful from the pieces of her broken heart. The woman who learned that home isn't something you lose. It's something you create, over and over again, until you get it right.